I thought I was just stopping by a friend's house. But when his mom smiled at me and said, "Lock the door," I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary evening. I hadn't planned on staying long. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just to grab something I'd left at my friend's place. I knocked, half expecting him to answer, but instead, the door opened, and there she was, his mother. She looked different than I remembered. Not in some dramatic way, but in the kind of way you notice when you slow down long enough to really look. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling around her face. She wore a simple, soft sweater that slipped casually off one shoulder, the kind of thing that wasn't meant to draw attention but somehow did. She gave me a smile that was warm, practiced, but behind it there was a flicker of surprise, maybe even a flicker of curiosity. "Oh, it's you," she said lightly. "He's not here. He ran out with some friends. But you can come in if you like." Her voice had that calm steadiness that comes with experience, but there was also something quieter beneath it, like she wasn't used to unexpected company. I stepped inside, and immediately, the house felt different. My friend's laughter, his music, his usual energy, it wasn't here. Instead, there was just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint tick of a clock on the wall. It felt like stepping into another version of the same space, one that belonged entirely to her. She walked ahead of me, barefoot, her steps soft against the wooden floor. I caught myself noticing the small things, the way her hand brushed lightly against the edge of the counter as she moved, the way she seemed so at ease in her own space. My chest tightened with something I didn't want to name yet. I told her I'd just grab my things and leave, not wanting to intrude, but she waved a hand dismissively. "Don't rush. I was just making tea. You can sit for a minute if you'd like." Something about the way she said it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like an invitation. And before I knew it, I was following her into the kitchen. She moved with a quiet grace, pulling mugs from the cabinet, filling the kettle. It was such an ordinary moment, but it carried weight. I realized then how rarely I'd seen her without the distraction of her son around, without the noise of a full house. Here, it was just her and me. I sat at the table, my fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the chair, trying not to look like I was staring as she poured water into the kettle. The sound of it filling, the sharp click as she set it on the stove, it all felt amplified in the silence. And in that silence, I couldn't ignore the thought that kept circling in my mind. This was the first time I had ever truly seen her. Not as someone's mother, not as a background presence, but as a woman. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of brewing tea, and in that stillness, I realized something had shifted. The kettle whistled softly, and she poured the steaming water over the tea leaves, her movements calm, practiced. I sat there, watching, trying not to let my eyes linger too long. When she placed the mug in front of me, the rising steam curled between us, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. She leaned against the counter, mug in hand, and looked toward the front hallway. "You should lock the door," she said casually. "Just in case." It was the kind of comment that could have passed unnoticed, practical, offhand, but the words hung in the air heavier than they should have. Lock the door. Something about the way she said it, the way her voice softened at the end, made it feel less like a reminder and more like an invitation. I smiled, leaning back in the chair. "Only if you stay inside with me." The words slipped out before I could stop them. Light, teasing, but they carried more weight than I intended. She froze just slightly, just enough for me to notice. Her eyes flickered to mine, searching, as if trying to decide whether I was joking or if there was something underneath. For a heartbeat, we just looked at each other, the air thick between us. Then she gave a small, restrained laugh, shaking her head as though brushing it away. "Your trouble," she said softly, though the corners of her mouth tugged upward. I should have laughed with her, made it easier, but I didn't. I just held her gaze a second longer, and in that second, I saw it, a tiny shift. Not a full admission, not even close, but a moment of awareness. She looked away first, taking a slow sip from her mug. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock in the hall. I became suddenly aware of the small details, the curve of her wrist as she held the mug, the faint line of concentration between her brows, the way she brushed a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. I took a sip of my tea, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. My chest felt tight, my pulse a little faster than it should have been. I wondered if she felt it too, if she noticed the shift, or if she was determined to pretend she hadn't. Finally, she broke the silence. "You always have something clever to say, don't you?" Her tone was light, teasing, but her eyes betrayed her. There was warmth in them, yes, but also caution, as though she was standing at the edge of something she wasn't sure she should cross. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. Only when someone inspires me. This time, she didn't laugh. She just looked at me, long enough for the moment to feel dangerous, long enough for me to wonder what would happen if neither of us looked away. Then, with a soft exhale, she lowered her eyes back to her cup, cradling it as though it gave her something steady to hold on to. And yet, even in retreat, her smile lingered, quiet, unspoken, impossible to ignore. The tea had cooled just enough to sip, and the warmth of it spread through my hands as I cupped the mug. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the soft light above us making the whole room feel like its own small world. Outside, the faint sound of passing cars came and went, but inside it was just the two of us, and that steady, almost too loud tick of the wall clock. She rested her elbow on the table, chin in her hand, and for a moment, she just studied me. "You've grown up," she said finally, her tone carrying that mix of fondness and distance older adults often use. But there was something else layered underneath it, something that made the words feel more personal, as though she was noticing not just that I'd aged, but that I'd changed. I shrugged, trying to downplay the flutter that stirred in my chest. Time does that to all of us, I guess. Her eyes lingered, searching my face, before she gave a quiet laugh. "You sound older too. Wiser. Not like your friend." I chuckled, shaking my head. "He's the same as always." Her smile softened, but then her gaze drifted away, as if she were looking through the years. She began telling me small things, memories from her 20s, dreams she once had about traveling, the career path she'd considered before motherhood had swept in and changed the rhythm of her life. Her words came slowly, almost as though she wasn't used to speaking them aloud. And the more she shared, the quieter her voice became, as though afraid of being overheard by ghosts from the past. I leaned in, elbows resting on the table, listening closely. The faint scratch of her thumbnail tapping against the ceramic mug punctuated her sentences. Her vulnerability wrapped around me like something fragile, something I didn't want to break. At one point, she slid the sugar bowl across the table toward me. I reached for it, and in the space of that small, ordinary gesture, our fingers brushed. It lasted no longer than a breath, but it felt like electricity skimming across my skin. She didn't pull away quickly, not like most people do when accidents happen. Instead, her hand lingered for half a second longer than necessary before retreating. The air between us shifted again, denser now, more difficult to ignore. I stirred my tea, though I no longer cared about the taste. My mind replayed that brief touch over and over, magnified by the silence that followed. "Finally," I said softly, "you ever wish you had chased those dreams?" Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a heartbeat, they looked raw, unguarded in a way that made my chest ache. She gave a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. All the time, the honesty in her voice cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to tell her she still could, that she wasn't too late, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence stretch, letting her know I'd heard her. For the first time, I felt like she wasn't just letting me into her kitchen. She was letting me into her inner world, and that was far more dangerous. The first low rumble of thunder rolled in from the distance just as she was finishing her tea. She glanced toward the window, as though confirming the weather for herself, then gave a small sigh. I didn't realize the rain was supposed to come tonight. By the time we moved into the living room, the storm had already settled in. Sheets of rain streaked across the glass, blurring the glow of streetlights outside. The house seemed darker now, quieter except for the occasional roll of thunder and the gentle hum of the storm wrapping around us. She flicked on a small lamp beside the couch. Its golden light cast a soft glow over the room, leaving the edges in shadow. She sat down with a kind of tired ease, tucking one leg beneath her, her sweater slipping a little farther off her shoulder. I hesitated, hovering in the doorway for a moment, before she patted the cushion beside her. "Don't just stand there," she said, her tone light, but her eyes steady. I crossed the room and lowered myself onto the couch. At first I kept a polite distance, but the couch wasn't large, and soon the fabric of her knee brushed against mine. It was such a small touch, so innocent on the surface, yet my entire body seemed to register it at once. The rain intensified, tapping hard against the glass, filling the silence between us. She leaned back, her head resting gently against the cushion, her profile outlined by the lamp's glow. I caught myself studying her. The curve of her cheek, the faint line of concentration between her brows, the way her lips parted slightly, as though she were lost in thought. Our knees remained pressed together, and neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of her body through the thin barrier of fabric, steady and undeniable. I wanted to reach for her hand, to see if she'd let me hold it, but hesitation held me back. The weight of what it would mean, what it could change, sat heavy on my chest. She turned her head then, eyes meeting mine. It wasn't a long look at first, just a glance, but it lingered, and in the lingering it became something more. Her gaze softened, almost daring, almost questioning, as though she wanted to know if I would be the one to bridge the distance. The thunder rumbled again, closer this time, shaking the windows. She gave a faint smile, almost to herself. "Storms always make me feel like the world shrinks," she murmured. "Like everything beyond these walls doesn't matter." Her voice was soft, but the words carried weight, settling between us. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, my heart hammering harder than it should. The house, the storm, the silence, they all pressed in around us, cocooning the two of us on that small couch. And in that moment, I knew. The space between us was no longer neutral. It was charged, fragile, and it was only a matter of time before one of us gave into it. The storm deepened, filling every corner of the house with its rhythm. The rain clattered against the windows in long, steady waves, and the occasional crack of thunder seemed to echo inside my chest. She sat beside me, shoulders slightly hunched, her hands wrapped around her mug though it was empty now. The lamplight caught the edges of her face, softening her expression, but her eyes were far away. "I don't usually talk this much," she admitted quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "It feels strange, opening up like this." I shifted slightly toward her, the couch dipping under our combined weight. "I don't mind. I like hearing it." She gave a small laugh, but it didn't carry joy. "Most people don't care to listen. Not really. Once you've lived past a certain point, people think they already know who you are. They stopped seeing you." Her words settled over me like the storm outside. I wanted to deny them, to tell her she was wrong, but I could see it in her eyes. The truth of it, the quiet ache. She rubbed at the handle of her empty mug with her thumb, a nervous gesture she probably didn't even notice. "Sometimes," she continued softly, "I feel invisible. Like I'm just here. A mom, someone's background, the one who makes sure everyone else is fine while no one ever asks if I am." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. The vulnerability in her voice pierced through me, raw and unguarded. I leaned forward, resting my forearm on my knee, searching for words that wouldn't sound empty. "You're not invisible," I said finally. My voice came out rougher than I expected. Her eyes lifted to mine, searching. "You're unforgettable," I added, steadier now. "I don't think I'll ever forget the way you are, the way you carry yourself, the things you say. You stand out, even when you don't realize it." For a long moment, neither of us moved. She just looked at me, her eyes glistening as though my words had cracked something open inside her. Slowly, almost tentatively, she set her mug on the coffee table and let her hand drift toward mine. Her fingers rested lightly on my wrist, not quite holding, just touching, barely there, but strong enough to ground me. My pulse thudded against her fingertips, betraying every ounce of nervous energy I felt. The storm raged outside, but the world inside had gone quiet. I could hear the faint tremor in her breath, feel the warmth of her hand, and in that silence, it felt like the two of us were standing on the edge of something we couldn't name aloud. I wanted to close the distance, to say more, to do more, but for now, her touch was enough. Her hand on my wrist wasn't just affection, it was trust. It was a silent confession, one that said she felt it too, even if neither of us dared to give it voice. And in that fragile moment, I knew everything had changed. The storm outside refused to let up. Lightning flashed briefly through the curtains, throwing silver shadows across the room, and a few seconds later thunder followed, low and steady, as though the sky itself was holding its breath with us. Her hand was still resting on my wrist, light but steady, as though it was the only anchor she had in that moment. I didn't move, afraid to break the spell, but every beat of my pulse beneath her fingertips seemed louder, more urgent, as if my body was speaking where words failed. She let out a soft, uneven sigh and finally pulled her hand back, brushing it nervously against her knee. But before the space between us could feel too wide, she shifted closer, her sweater brushing against my arm. She looked at me, really looked, and for a second, it was as though the storm had vanished. Then, almost without thinking, she reached up. Her fingers grazed my temple as she tucked a strand of my hair back, slow and deliberate. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a current racing through me, so sharp I had to stop myself from shivering. I caught her hand before she could pull away. My palm pressed over hers, gently, holding it there against my cheek. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, cool at first, but then steady, grounding. I closed my eyes for a moment, just breathing her in. The faint scent of her perfume, the softness of her hand, the undeniable weight of what this meant. When I opened my eyes again, she hadn't moved. Her lips were parted slightly, her chest rising and falling with the kind of breath you take when you're about to step into unknown territory. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The silence said everything. The hesitation, the fear, the desire threading its way between us. I brushed my thumb lightly across the back of her hand, not enough to claim, only enough to reassure. She didn't pull away. The rain hammered harder against the windows, but all I could focus on was the way her gaze softened, the way her body tilted almost imperceptibly toward mine. It was as though every unspoken thought of the night had condensed into this single, fragile moment. I wanted to close the distance completely, but I didn't. Instead, I just held her hand to my cheek, memorizing the feel of her skin, the steadiness of her presence. My heart raced, but my body stayed still, respecting the delicate balance between us. Her other hand trembled in her lap before finally lifting, resting lightly against my arm. The weight of it was subtle, but it sealed the moment. It wasn't an accident anymore. It was a choice. We stayed like that, her hand on my cheek, mine holding hers, the storm cocooning us outside the window, as though time itself had paused to give us permission. And for the first time all evening, I knew she wasn't just allowing the closeness. She wanted it too. The storm outside had softened. The thunder no longer cracked with force but rumbled faintly, like an old drumbeat fading into the distance. Rain still pattered against the windows, steady and calm, a reminder of the cocoon that had formed around us inside the house. Her hand was still against my cheek, mine wrapped gently around it. We stayed like that for what felt like a long, suspended breath, both of us afraid that moving too quickly would shatter what we'd built. Finally, with a trembling kind of courage, she let her hand slip from my face and instead placed it against my chest. The gesture was simple, but it undid me. Her palm pressed lightly over my shirt, and I knew she could feel the rapid, uneven beat of my heart. She exhaled, almost a laugh, almost a confession, and then leaned in closer. Her head came to rest against me, her cheek brushing the fabric of my shirt, settling just above my heart. Instinctively, my arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her nearer. I didn't pull her tightly. I just held her in a way that told her she could stay as long as she wanted. The warmth of her body against mine was both comforting and overwhelming, her hair brushing lightly beneath my chin, carrying a faint scent that was entirely hers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the soft rhythm of her breathing, the rain against the glass, and the steady beat of my heart echoing between us. And then, in the quietest voice, she whispered, "I feel safe with you." The words were fragile, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I tightened my arm around her just slightly, a silent promise in the gesture. "You are," I murmured back. "You always will be." She stayed there, her head nestled against me, and I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the moment seep into me. The world outside the locked door no longer mattered. The storm, the empty house, the distance of years, all of it faded into irrelevance. What mattered was this: her trust, her closeness, the way she allowed herself to be seen, not as someone's mother or caretaker, but simply as herself. Her fingers brushed absently along my side, a soft, distracted motion that made my pulse skip. Not out of boldness, but out of comfort, like she was reminding herself that I was real, that I was here. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The intimacy was already there, deeper than any hurried gesture could capture. It was in the way she leaned against me without hesitation, the way her body relaxed into mine as though she'd been carrying weight for years and finally found a place to set it down. As the rain softened further, the silence in the room felt less heavy, more like a blanket wrapped around us. The locked door, I realized, wasn't about keeping others out anymore. It was about keeping this moment in, protecting the fragile, beautiful truth that had unfolded between us. I lowered my chin slightly, brushing my lips against her hair in the gentlest of gestures. She sighed, and her arms curled around my waist, holding me as though she never wanted to let go. And in that quiet, storm-sheltered night, I understood. Sometimes the most powerful closeness isn't in what you say or even what you do. It's in the simple, steady act of holding someone and knowing they've chosen to stay.